It's time for the Phil Ferguson Show.
That's right, everybody. You are listening to the Phil Ferguson episode. This is a bonus episode, so patrons, you will not be paying for this, but you still get it a little early, so that's all good. I didn't have this planned, but an opportunity came up to make this bonus episode so that you could all hear about a new project being put on by Hemant Mehta, and he's here with us today to talk about it. Hemant, how are you doing?
I'm good. Thanks for having me, Phil.
It is my pleasure. And of course, late last night, which is way too late for someone who has a couple little kids, you emailed me about this project. And instead of me just reading and describing it, let's hear it straight from you. What are you doing? What's going on?
Sure. So for years, anyone who's read my website at Friendly Atheist, you know I write about politics, religion, and a lot of legal stuff, but it's all current events based. And so if I write about something like the Pledge of Allegiance, it's about some new lawsuit or some new controversy that has happened because of it. And that does pose some kind of restriction because I have to talk about the issue that's happening today. And it doesn't really give me a chance to go back into the history of the pledge, which I find really fascinating. And so what this project is that I'm really excited about is I've been doing research for months now, putting together kind of a huge history of the Pledge of Allegiance, not just how it got written, because I think a lot of people kind of have the Wikipedia version of how it got written by some socialist minister way back when, and it did not have under God in it. And then, politicians put it in there in the 50s, and it's been controversial ever since. Something like that. That's kind of the short version of the pledge a lot of people know, and it's so much more complicated than that. And the under God bit is almost anticlimactic, actually, because all the stuff leading up to it was where it really got controversial. And I feel like even as someone steeped into church-state separation and the legal aspect of it as much as you or I can be, even I didn't know some of the details that went into this. And so it was a fascinating chance to kind of, let me explore the pledge. But again, I know there are textbooks out there that can do that. I just find them kind of boring. So my hope is, let me put together a detailed history of the pledge, all the controversies, all the cases, what the big issues were, how they ended up, and everything in between. But let me see if I could do that and make it interesting. And so that's what I've been working on for months now. And what it will end up being is this podcast that is several hours long. And I want to share this with everyone as soon as I'm done with it. But it does take a lot of work to, do the research and put it all out there in a, well-made, organized way that doesn't feel just slapped together, because that would be awful, right? Where you just feel like, this person put no effort into it. So I'm basically, I've been working for months now on a lot of the background and the history and the research of all of this. And at some point, I hope to record it, and I want to put that out there. And so that's the gist of this project.
Yeah, so I wanted to make sure, and you segued right into it brilliantly, and I didn't expect any less. This is not going to be just a 2-page blog post, and yay, I made a longer than average blog post. This is going to be a podcast unique to this topic, and I'm assuming, correct me here if I'm wrong, that this is going to be made in such a way that everyone can share this with friends and family so that everyone can learn the history and the background behind this stuff.
That's exactly right. And if you read my site and you think, oh, this is just going to be like some atheist, trashing the Pledge of Allegiance. It's not. This is very much I'm an atheist, but I am not telling this as some sort of atheist advocacy story. I want to tell you the history of the pledge, and that includes a lot of religious figures as the good guys in the story, because that's the way the story has to be told. And I think a wide audience can actually appreciate that. And you're right, like, it's not a 2-page summary. This is not something I would post as a regular article anywhere. As I sit here with you right now over the phone, it is like 35 pages and counting of like not large font. There's a lot of stuff that I want to talk about, and a lot of history that needs to be told for people to really get a sense of just how messed up the Pledge of Allegiance can be.
Now, at one point I had heard, and maybe you've gotten into this already in your research, that there was an original way to salute the flag. Have you found that?
Oh yeah, that is a big part of the story. And you're right, like at one point when they started doing a salute with the Pledge of Allegiance, it looked very much the way you've seen maybe in pictures of Nazis saluting Hitler.
Yeah.
Like that, put your fingers together, have your arm outstretched, palm down. And they did that in the U.S. before we got involved in World War II. But after World War II got started, it's like, you know what? This is not a great idea. We should change this. And so eventually they did change the way they saluted the flag. But the funny thing is that's only a minor controversy as far as saluting the flag goes, because there's a lot of people, religious people, who said, you are asking me to essentially worship a false idol. Like, I don't want to worship the flag. I don't want to salute the flag. You're asking me to put the flag above God, even temporarily, even symbolically. And that alone was controversial.
Well, it's one of those things that I myself have a personal objection to anything I'm compelled to do. I just have this weird pushback mechanism in my brain, which gets me into trouble. But when you say you have to do the Pledge of Allegiance now, I'm just like, why do I have to? I mean, if I'm compelled to say that I like America, how much do I really like America?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And one of the newspapers, I believe, that actually, after the Supreme Court said, you know what, it's optional now, you don't have to do it, one of the newspapers, I think it was the Christian Science Monitor, if I have it correct, said something, and I'm paraphrasing here, they said something like, people who are genuinely patriotic, even if that's 99% of the people, that is way better than having 100% of people compelled to salute the flag. And that's exactly the idea that you're getting at, which is if you're compelled to say how much you love something, that doesn't mean as much as if you genuinely want to do it. But the way they did the pledge in public schools for so long, it was, no, you got to do this, and we're going to punish you if you don't.
Well, and kids still get punished today. So what other court cases?
Yeah, they get punished today, even if it's not in the rules. Yeah.
Yeah. What other court cases have you come up about this? Can you give us a
so
sample?
There are 3 separate cases that went all the way to the Supreme Court involving the Pledge of Allegiance. There were a couple different ones that made their way up to the appellate courts and could have been a bigger deal had the appellate courts ruled a different way. But the amazing thing, maybe the most fascinating story to tell about the Pledge of Allegiance, is that the first time it went to the courts, so to the Supreme Court, the court ruled overwhelmingly that everyone had to say the Pledge of Allegiance. Like, the school districts could require it. And then, within the span of a few years, a number of those Supreme Court justices realized, oh no, we made a huge mistake. And 3 years later, they basically brought the same kind of case right back up to them. And they're like, you know what, we're going to change our minds on this. You don't have to do it. But the whole story of why did they change their minds? And like, why didn't they figure this out when they were ruling on the first case? That's fascinating in and of itself. And part of that is they actually knew they were making a mistake that first time that they ruled on this issue. And just to hear them say, like, yeah, I don't think it's that big of a deal, but I'm going to rule this way, but I kind of see what the other side is. And then they go ahead and rule the way they do. And then they see all the damage that it's causing and all the chaos that it's creating. And they're like, oh, my, what have we done? And they even wrote that in a different Supreme Court opinion where they were like, we know this case has nothing to do with the pledge, but while we're here, we're just going to go ahead and say we made a big mistake. And if we ever get a chance to correct it, we're totally going to correct it. And this is like in the 1940s. And so it's those are the stories that I'm just like, you know what? I'm not used to hearing about that. I'm used to hearing about the results of a case and the ramifications of a case, but not the, here's what was happening behind the scenes. And it involved like another justice calling those like flippers the axis of evil of sorts. And the irony there is that the one justice who was leading them to say everyone has to say the pledge, he's the guy that was the progressive hero, like the founder of the ACLU.
Wow, that's amazing. Now, another thing that I'm sure you've already got in mind with the podcast is you've seen the Porky Pig video?
Oh, where he's saying the pledge without under God.
Yeah.
Yes, and so this is the interesting thing, because when I've been writing about the pledge forever, it seems like one of the things as an atheist, I feel like I have to hammer home every time I write about it, is that the pledge was never written with under God in it. It was pushed in there for political reasons, much later on in the 1950s. And people tend to, I always think like, oh, that's the part no one knows about the pledge, right? Like that it wasn't always in there. And it turns out, I think a lot of people now anyway, they understand that under God was pushed in there later. What they don't understand is why people were protesting the pledge even before that. And one of the most fascinating stories I read about that I had no idea about was that, like, I think in 1916, there was a young African-American boy who protested saying the Pledge of Allegiance. This is back in the day when it was required in public schools in certain parts of the country. He said, I don't want to say it because I don't believe there really is liberty and justice for all, for everyone in this country, which is something you would totally hear today if someone were protesting. And I have heard it in recent years where people fought over that. But here's a kid in 1916 saying as much. The only reason I think we haven't really heard about that story is because the courts basically said, you can't make him say it. Like, let him not make a big deal out of this. If he doesn't want to say it, the rest of you just move on. And it didn't become an issue, so it kind of faded away. That didn't happen all the time, though. Like in some cases when religious people protested, the court said, too bad, we don't care about your religious rights. Like, you got to say the pledge. It's good for the country, you immigrants. And they made him do it. And so it was just very interesting to see some of the same controversies we have today were quite literally happening 100 years ago.
Yeah, it is truly amazing. Another soundbite, I don't know if you're familiar with this one. I think it's from a movie called The Bells of St. Mary with Frank Sinatra as the priest / head of the school. And I think it's filmed in New England or New York or somewhere in that area. And at some point, all of the kids go out, and this film is so old, of course, it's black and white. And they go outside and they do the Pledge of Allegiance. And these are Catholic school children doing the Pledge of Allegiance, and they don't say under God.
Yeah.
So it just amazing.
And again, it wasn't even a big deal. It wasn't, people didn't think you needed God in it. It was actually a push by a religious group that they're like, they started doing it internally where they would say the pledge was under God, and then they pressured Congress to do the same thing. And a minister, actually, there was a day, I believe it was Eisenhower, was in church, and the minister sees the president in the front row, and he basically uses the sermon to make a pitch for here's why you really need under God in the pledge. And like there had been 18, I think, different bills in Congress to get under God in there, and none of them had passed. But finally, after that sermon, there was this huge push of nationalism to say, like, yeah, we're a Christian nation, and Eisenhower signed that bill finally.
Yeah, it's one of those things, and of course now it's used as a justification for other potential violations of our rights because under God is already there.
Yeah, it's one of those slippery slope type of things that if you can get kids to say we're a nation under God in a arguably innocuous sort of way, what else can we make them do? We can put, in God we trust on the walls of our school. We can teach the Bible in school, but, in a secular way. And it's all this stuff where they're pushing God in, but they know better than to say it's for religious reasons, but it's working. Yep. And a lot of the times courts don't really have an argument to use against it. And they know that. The Christian groups that fight for this sort of thing know that. So it's one of those things where, if you can get this in the schools, and remember, under God happened before, like in the pledge, that happened before the Supreme Court said you can't force kids to read the Bible in school as part of like a prayer service or something. And so this was just part of a big push where everyone just was assumed to be a Christian.
Yeah, it's just by default. Now you have some kind of Kickstarter thingy. What's that all about?
Yeah.
How do I learn more?
Sure. Yeah. So basically, this project has taken over my life in so many ways, but it's a project I really love. But basically, like I said, I'm going to put together this podcast that's going to be X number of episodes long. I haven't decided how many yet, but telling this story and all the aspects of it. And so here's where the problem is. To put that together and to spend time away from my website where I actually can make some money to do this podcast, which is like a passion project, it does take a lot of time to record it in a professional studio so it sounds like it's worth your time, and to make it look good for a wide audience. That takes some money and time. So the Kickstarter is basically a way for people to pitch in to say, look, I love the idea of this podcast. I want early access to this project. I want to have my name mentioned as a producer of this podcast. Those are all things you could do by going to the Kickstarter and pitching in. And if you give $25 to the Kickstarter, you will get early access to every episode of the series.
Now, the Kickstarter, this is a one-time thing, so you're not paying $1 per episode. You would just pay $5 one time and you're done.
That's right. If the Kickstarter for donors is just a one-time, if you give, you're going to get all these episodes. You might get them early. You might get your name mentioned in them, depending on what level you give to. But that's it. And then when I'm done with this podcast, I'm done with this podcast. And then if the Kickstarter is successful, maybe I'll move on to a different project along the same lines. Like the whole point I was trying to explore was there's so many Supreme Court cases that deal with church-state separation, and I want to dig deep into them. And I thought I would start with one pledge lawsuit that made it to the Supreme Court. And it turned out that story was so all-encompassing that I'm like, I can't just do one episode, a shorter episode on this one story, because this one story can't be told that quickly, not if you're doing it any justice. So this project is all about the pledge. Other future ones will be about different issues of church-state separation, but that's what the Kickstarter is all about, because there's a lot of recording in a professional space that has to be done, a lot of music and graphic design, and actually putting out the final content and getting it out to the public. Yeah,
absolutely. And so, listeners, this is not just him and a couple of friends sitting around a microphone talking about current business and current affairs, which is totally cool.
No,
those podcasts have their place, but this is different.
Hey, I do have a podcast where me and a friend talk about current events. I mean, that's all well and good. This is separate from that, and in my head, it's way more scripted, and I'm going to put this in big quote fingers, much more professional. And you know what? The show that I'm really trying to model it after, if you've ever heard it, it's called Hardcore History. This guy, Dan Carlin, does a wonderful job of saying, I'm going to tell you the story of, for example, World War I. But how do you tell that story? He ends up taking several years to tell the story, but when he puts out an episode, it's like 4 or 5 hours long, and you feel like he's just scratching the surface. But I remember trying. I heard about that. I'm like, there's no way this is going to be interesting. Like 4 or 5 hours for part one of a World War One history. Are you kidding me? And then I started listening to it on a road trip, and like 3 hours later, I'm like, I'm not leaving my car until this is done, because he's just a really good storyteller. And when I was reading books about the Pledge of Allegiance, I'm like, it's good information, but it is boring. And so it's like, I wonder if I could tell this story in a more interesting way, in a more relatable way. And I don't have to give you the life story of every character because it's not interesting. I can get to the good stuff, the important stuff, and focus on that.
I like it. I like it a lot. And I like the idea that this is going to be timeless. So it's not just something you listen to, as you said, X number of episodes, but you can listen to them all and you can hear the story. And a year from now, someone can find this and hear the story. A year from now, we can share it with a friend.
Yes.
Or a family member who says, you should stand for the pledge, and here's why, and it's clean, and it's simple. They don't understand the revisions. They don't understand when Under God was put in. They don't know all the controversy. And if someone's looking for a new podcast 5 years from now, you can say, hey, you might want to check this out.
I am definitely trying to make it an evergreen podcast so that it's irrespective of whatever's happening in the news with the story of the pledge, this will still be useful information to everybody. And by the way, I will also make sure that all the research that I'm relying on and all the books, I will make sure all of that is public information too. And again, I want to tell this story. I want to make it interesting, not just for the audience. I want to make it interesting for me. But it's something that I probably couldn't just write up on the website because it's just too detailed, too extensive, and too not related to anything happening right now.
Absolutely. And I want to make
even though it does kind of permeate the culture.
I want to make sure my listeners understand also that when you contribute, you're not just throwing money at Hemant. You are helping to cover the incredible amount of time he's spending on this, but you're actually paying people to help you do this, right?
Yes. In terms of writing the music for the show, in terms of graphic design for the podcast, because I could just draw it on a crayon, but that would not look good. And being a recording studio to let me rent their space and record this in a good way. That stuff doesn't come necessarily cheap. Not if you want it done well. And so I want to make sure this is done right. Because I think for me, the worst thing would be if I do all this work and then put out a really crappy product. I want to make this really good. If I'm going to do it once, let's do it right. And so that's kind of what the Kickstarter is for. Sure. And by the way, I should point out there's probably other costs that will accrue along the way, whether it's a website just for the podcast or the distribution of it. So that stuff all has to be taken into account, but that's where the Kickstarter's from.
Absolutely. And I would love to give over this podcast, the audio only, the link, but Hemant, you didn't win the short link victory here. So
I know, and Kickstarter doesn't make it easy to share a smaller link. But if anyone's interested in this project, the best way they could find it is just to go to Kickstarter.com and type in Pledge of Allegiance. And the actual page for my thing is called A Not So Brief History of the Pledge of Allegiance, the podcast. You'll find that on there if you search for the Pledge of Allegiance on Kickstarter.
And what I'll also do is I will put this in the show notes. I know almost no one ever checks there, but it happens. I'll put it in the show notes. I will share this link on my Facebook page and the Phil Ferguson Show page. And, of course, you're sharing it around. So if you're interested, which hopefully a bunch of you are, it's not going to be that hard to find. But, if you search Hemant Mehta or Friendly Atheist, or like you said, go to Kickstarter, Pledge of Allegiance, you should be able to find it. If you still you can't find the links, I don't know about you, Hemant, but they can email me, phil@polarisfinancialplanning.com, and I can send you the link directly, but I think you should be able to find it.
Send me a tweet at Hemant Mehta.
Excellent. Now, for you in general, what's going on? You got any talking gigs coming up?
Yeah, you know what? I am speaking in a few places. I'm still working out the schedule for everything, but for now, it's just focusing on the website and focusing on writing the series.
I like it. I like it. Anything else we should know about this before we wrap up?
I am just making a general plea to your listeners. The reason I'm making this podcast in some ways is because I don't think there's anything else like it out there, not done by an atheist, not done with an issue that we all take so seriously, especially if you care about church-state separation. And my pledge to all of you is that I will make it worth your while. I want to make a podcast series that is interesting and that you will appreciate and that you could share with people who may be religious, because this isn't advocacy for atheism. This is about just a controversial ritual that we do in school. And so I will pledge to you that I will do my best to make this worthwhile. And I hope you like the project enough to consider making any sort of contribution to it, because that sends the message to me that, you know what, I should keep doing this because people like it.
I like it. Well, Hemant, thank you so much for spending some time here on the Phil Ferguson Show. We're going to get this up right away. And listeners, it's just going to end here. I'll go into the end music. Hemant, once again, thank you so much for being on.
Thank you, Phil. I really appreciate that. Thank you to your listeners.